Welcome back to Close Up. He emerged from a competitive field of Republican candidates in 2018 to take on Congresswoman Annie Kuster. While Steve Negron faced long odds in a midterm that swung heavily in the direction of the Democrats, he's running again and likes his chances in a year he will share the ballot with President Donald Trump. Steve Negron is our guest this morning.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for asking me.
So when we last had you here in March or April, we were talking about you wanted to really try and focus on clearing the field and getting a clean shot at the incumbent. Not going to happen this time.
Right.
Looks like you got a primary. Lynn Blankenbecker was in the mix there in the last time around.
Right.
How do you win this primary again?
Well, I think the primary is going to be won by actually building on what we did the last time. You know, we, in a bad year, we took 42% of the vote, and probably the most votes in any midterm since 2002. So that's our starting point. Not that we vote counted, but 113,990 voted for our campaign last year, and that's our starting point. And so we believe that with the president on top of the ticket, and also with the Senate race that's happening, we believe that people are going to come out and vote for us, and I think we're going to have an excellent chance this time. One-on-one
contests can get intense, as Eddie Edwards and Andy Sanborn proved the last time around in the 1st congressional district. When we had Lynn Blankenbecker on the show here a few months back, she was saying she felt that there was some rough treatment in the last primary, and she assigned that to some of your supporters.
Sure.
Do you think this is also going to be a rough primary based on what she said already?
Well, first of all, our goal is to take out Ed Kuster and not necessarily focus on anything else. Lynn Blankenbecker has a stellar military career. There were some people out there that took some umbrage with some of the things that she had put out. It wasn't our campaign at all. So what we're looking for is what do we need to do to bring back Ed Kuster, because she's now a 4-term incumbent that, quite frankly, isn't speaking for the people of the 2nd District.
Let's shift to policy here. The LA Times is reporting that last month was the first month in the recorded history of refugee resettlement in the United States that America took in 0 refugees from around the world. Again, these are people who are in dire straits, essentially, facing difficult situations. We bring them to this country because there's room for them and they need help and freedom. Right. If we aren't admitting any refugees, is that acceptable to you? Is that really the beacon of freedom of the United States?
No, absolutely not. But remember too, Adam, we're not the only country that can take in refugees. We're not supposed to be the stopgap to end all things for the world. So I believe that we are a country that still is that beacon of freedom. We have to polish the glass a little bit sometimes, because we have tarnished it, I think. So if there are opportunities for us to handle those refugees, we still should be able to do that. I don't think we should have a zero position of not having refugees, but I think that the world, along with the United States, has to be able to help all those people that are in dire needs.
Do you take any issue with the Trump immigration policy? You look at your story itself. I mean, this is the American immigrant success story from the family perspective.
Yes, sir.
Within a couple of generations, it's proof of what freedom can do.
Right.
The Trump administration has, by policy, wanted to focus more on European immigration. Is that a mistake?
Well, I think, first of all, we're a land of laws, and whatever the laws are that we have in our immigration policy is what we need to follow. I believe we need to look at a wholesale review of the immigration policy, not just immigration, but the visa policy as well, and make sure that we're doing what's in the best interest of the United States, and also how we can still be that beacon of freedom for all the people that have come here before them.
Amnesty, is that part of it? I mean, do people who are here illegally, are they going to get a shot at staying, or do they have to go?
Well, I think that's part of that whole immigration policy. I'm not a firm believer that you get to jump to the head of the line and all of a sudden just because you were here. I believe that there has to be some discussion about what that is. I'm not in favor of just a carte blanche, say if you were here, you get to stay here. People have to be vetted, and whatever that policy is and that process is, I think is going to be an output of what that immigration reform look is going to be like.
Another hot button issue, obviously, gun policy. Is there any bill out there that you would be willing to attach yourself to as a supporter of the Second Amendment that would try to address our issue of gun violence and mass shootings in this country?
Well, that's a great question. I think everybody wants to look at it as the issue of the instrument that's being used. I believe it's not the instrument. I believe that it's about a mental health issue. I believe if you look at the both federal and state laws, there's over 10,000 gun policies and laws on there. It certainly isn't stopping what's out there right now. Adding more laws, I don't think is going to fix the issue. I think we have to have a broader scope about what it is and how people are getting access to those guns and why they're using them. And I think it's a mental health issue, not a Second Amendment issue.
When you talk about mental health, I'm guessing you're not talking about red flag laws.
No.
But so what would the policy be? What would you be trying to do to prevent those shootings?
Well, certainly I'd have to look at, do these people need help from a mental perspective, right? Do we have enough mental health professionals that are out there to help these people and these individuals? Because to me, Adam, why does somebody feel that that's the only recourse that they have or he or has? I believe it's wrong for them to do that clearly, and I think we have to be able to have an opportunity for these people to get the help that they need.
Universal background checks, that's something that has broad support in polling, isn't necessarily popular among Republicans on Capitol Hill. Why is that expansion an infringement on Second Amendment
Well,
rights?
certainly we have background checks now. So I don't know what people say, what the difference is between a background check that we have currently right now and what a universal background check means. I think, you know, you got gun shows, you have people, you have federal firearm license dealers, FFL dealers, they have to do background checks. So I don't know, by expanding that, is that going to change anything? So people need to kind of convince me what this universal check is going to do more than what we currently have right now in the books.
The impeachment inquiry, have you been following the testimony
Very
much at
so.
all? Okay, so what do you think about what's going on there in Washington, and where would you come down if you were sitting on that bench there in the committee?
Well, you know, as a matter of fact, before we go on, people understand what's happening between the Ukraine and the United States. And so on my spare time, I read the treaty between the United States and the Ukraine. And in Article 1 of the treaty, it says that we need to help each other to stop criminal activity. That's in the treaty between the United States and the Ukraine. And that's a treaty that was signed by President Bill Clinton. So what I would ask the question is, if these things have been happening before President Trump took office, why haven't these kind of things been brought to the forefront earlier? So I think it's well within the president's responsibility and purview to try to root out criminal activity as per the treaty between ourselves and the Ukraine. Look, you know, there was an individual by the name of Lavrentiy Beria. People don't know who that name is, but he was in charge of the secret police for Stalin. And he's the one that so famously said, "Bring me the man and I'll find you the crime." And so what I think what we've had right now is people have jumped ahead of the gun. They've wanted to go ahead and impeach this president as far back as 2017 without having the potential process of due process. So I don't believe anything that the president has done or said. Certainly him trying to root out crime is part of the treaty between ourselves and the Ukraine, and nothing that he's done, in my opinion, Adam, is reaching to the level of any sort of impeachment issue.
If we take on face value that the Bidens were up to something in Ukraine, why not investigate that at the beginning of the administration rather than now, when Vice President Biden's running for president?
Absolutely, and I would pose it differently. Why didn't we investigate that when President Obama was in the White House, right? Because these things happened underneath his term as president. So that's a good question. I don't know why it was just at this time that happened. I think if the president is doing his job, if this person had been John Smith, nobody would have had any issues of it. It's just that it happens to be Joe Biden and his son Hunter is what people are up in arms about.
So I'm guessing you would not be a vote to impeach based on what you're saying?
No, sir.
So the underlying conduct, though, would you be okay with a future Democratic president calling up a world leader and saying, "Hey, I really would like you to investigate my Republican opponent"? That's okay.
If you know, it was really funny if President Obama had done this under his term when he had the purview and the responsibility under the treaty between the United States and Ukraine. Absolutely, that's part of his responsibility. So, you know, people want to make this magnanimous leap that the only reason why the president did this is to try to hurt Joe Biden. I'm just not in that camp right now.
Do you think we'll be talking about, if you're the nominee, essentially,
Yes.
do you think we'll be talking about Ann Kuster's vote on impeachment, whatever it is, come September of 2020?
Absolutely, and we're going to make it a point to talk about it, right? She had actually wanted to do this long before this whistleblower had come forward. So I would ask her, why was it that you felt that this president had any impeachable offense long before anybody had brought up this whistleblower? So there's a predisposed idea of them wanting to do that, and I believe they're just trying to overturn a duly elected president.
And also, we've heard already a lot of talk of bringing the squad into this race. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Right.
Is that a line of attack you think is going to land with voters here in New Hampshire?
Well, I think, first of all, you know, Ann Kuster should be focusing on New Hampshire and not this squad that's really kind of left of center and really not really democratic, in my opinion. You know, is more radical thinking. You know, my aunt Daisy used to say, "Cuidado con la gatita," which is be careful of the cat. And I believe that AOC is that cat. I believe that, you know, Ann Kuster has tried to align herself. She has this somewhat of a movement, I think, and I think she's trying to remain relevant. I don't necessarily agree at all with anything that Ocasio-Cortez says, and I don't think it's in the best interest of the New Hampshire 2nd Congressional Representative to align herself with her.
Mr. Negron, thanks for joining us
Adam,
and
thank
bringing
you
the
so much.
bilingual flavor to close up. We
Absolutely.
appreciate that.